A couple of weeks ago, I asked on my community tab if you had any questions about life in rural China. And I got a lot of questions. I'm going to answer some of them. I'm really sorry if I don't answer your question, but it's just a lot of questions and I feel like it would take forever to answer all of them. And yeah, but some of them were also answered in a previous video, Q&A video. I'll link to that below. And just like I did in that video, I will in this video also write out like timestamps in case you just want to know a couple of questions and don't want to listen through all of it, because I think this will also be pretty long. You can just go below in the description box and see what time a certain question is answered, and you can just click on that so you don't have to watch all of it. So I'm just going to start. So what do you like and dislike about living in rural China? I like the food, and we're not self-sufficient, but a lot, like the majority of what we eat is self-produced, and to me that is just amazing. It's wonderful, and that's probably what I like the most. Then why I like living in rural areas is another question, but that's what I particularly like about China and living in rural China. In Sweden, a lot of people in the countryside are perhaps self-sufficient in vegetables, not a lot, but a few. That's more common, but here they're also self-sufficient in wheat and potatoes and rapeseed oil. That's our own oil, and that's very uncommon in Sweden. I think that's pretty cool and something I really like. Or what I dislike about living in rural China is, I think what I dislike is when it's raining a lot or it's super cold and I need to go to the toilet. Or actually even more, I dislike that what we're using is coal, like black coal, to keep the fire going. So in winter, the air is really polluted. That's a dislike. How do you cope with the not so convenient rural living environment? For example, toilets and showering. And the way I cope with it is just that I just accept it. It's just the way it is. But I do get, like, for example, if I need to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and it's in the middle of winter, I do think it's really annoying. But it's just the way it is. Like, regardless of where you live, there will be things that are annoying. It's just a matter of getting used to it. In Sweden, I usually shower every day. Here, I don't shower every day. And like, if it's cold, I will shower. You know, I won't shower my hair and my whole body at the same time because it's just too cold. You know, I had to take it in steps. And it's just a matter of getting used to it, I think. Now that you have experienced both rural and cosmopolitan life in China, which setting is more adventurous and fun? I think it depends on what you think is fun. So I like being in cities sometimes and visiting cities, and so for me, living in rural China is more fun. But I don't know if it's very adventurous. I think it depends on you rather, if you're seeking adventures or not. I'm not really seeking adventures anymore. Before I did, and when I was traveling in China, when I just got here, I traveled to many rural areas, and that was pretty adventurous to me. You know, going to places where you didn't know anyone and where people didn't speak English, and when you were just, you know, seeing what happened. I didn't plan a lot of my travels. I just kind of bought a train ticket somewhere and then saw what happened. So I think if you are adventurous, you can be adventurous anywhere. But yeah, it's just a matter of preference, I think. Are there cinemas or any good restaurants where we live? And there is no cinema. Sometimes they have in the little square in the village, they have like they screen a movie. And restaurants, they do, but the restaurants here are mostly Muslim owned, very catering towards Muslims and people who eat meat. So it's not a lot of vegetarian options in the village. Like, you can get some vegetarian noodles or vegetarian mian, which is really nice, of course, but for me, I prefer going into the city if I want to go to a nice restaurant, because they usually have more vegetarian options. Like, there are some really nice vegetarian and vegan restaurants in Xining. So personally, I prefer that. But yeah, there are restaurants here, quite a few. How often do you go shopping? And what places do you usually visit? And is online shopping convenient? So when we go shopping, we sometimes buy vegetables here. There are often little cars coming, selling vegetables off the back of the car. And we buy vegetables there sometimes. There are little vegetable stores, but those vegetables are usually not as fresh and expensive compared to the ones if you go into a bigger little town or the cities. So we buy our vegetables and our food in different areas. Yeah, sometimes in the village, sometimes in the city. And online shopping is very convenient. Yeah, you can get almost anything, and sometimes it takes a little longer to get here because we're in Qinghai, but usually only a couple of days. How often we go shopping, that also depends. Like in summer, obviously a lot of our food comes from the garden, so we don't need to go shopping as much, although lately we have been buying a lot of noodles and things like that almost daily, because there are stores in the village where they make their own noodles, so you can just go and buy there. And we do that a lot because we've been just too busy to make our own noodles from scratch. So we've been doing that a lot. So sometimes every day, sometimes, if you want to know how often we go into the city, that's maybe a couple of times a month. How self-sufficient is the village? Food, water, and materials. So when it comes to food, it used to be self-sufficient when people did not have as many maybe requirements, or many they didn't want as many different types of vegetables. Like when they were self-sufficient, obviously during winter there are not fresh vegetables available, so people would usually eat meat, and they would eat dried vegetables, or they would eat canned. I don't know if it's called canned, but kind of like preserved vegetables. But nowadays people during winter want fresh veggies, so they buy them. But if people had to, they would survive without buying anything. Most people here comes to the food. Then water and materials, that's difficult. I don't really know. Now I know the water we have in a house comes from Datong, which is a town, a village, not a village, a city close by. And but I also know that if for some reason sometimes there is no water available, we get it from the mountain here, which is in the village. So also if we didn't get water from the city, the town, or like the village here, would be fine because they have water from the mountains. How is farmland portioned out to families in a community, and can one purchase a farm? So the farmland is like inherited within the family. So from like the family to the son, or to the sons. The daughters in rural China, in this area at least, the daughters are married off to another family. So the daughters become part of another family and then gets that son's land. If there are a lot of sons, then the land will be split up. So there are families here with very little land because they've had many sons in the family. Can one purchase a farm? You cannot buy land in China. You can only rent land, and obviously in rural China the land is not rented, but it's not the property of the families, but it's the land you have available for you. But if you come as an outsider and want to get land in rural China or a farm, you can rent it from the farmer, which I know people in Beijing that have done that. So they rent it maybe for 30 or 40 years, and then it's kind of like their own farm, but it's technically not their property. It's very difficult for a person from the city to get a hukou, which is get registered as a villager if you're not born in rural China. So it's tricky when it comes to education and things for a child who is not born in rural China but wants to have education in rural China, which is not very common. But yeah. What is it that you can get in rural areas where there is none or little in the city? I think peace and quiet and nature sounds and a garden with loads of veggies and being really close to the fields and not being in a city. For me, that's quite important, to not be in a city it makes me stressed out to be in a city for too long, and I feel like I lose connection to nature and to myself in a city. So for me, that's what I get in a rural area. How do you and your family make a living in rural China? So I'll start with my parents-in-law. My mother-in-law and father-in-law, they are working in the fields and producing food for themselves. We don't sell any of our produce at all, which is very common in this area of China, in this village at least. A lot of farmers, when they're not busy in the fields and when it's not like weather conditions allow, they go into the city, and then there is this area outside like a bank where other people who need workers come. And then they stand there and wait, and then they get like called by someone, and they will do like building work and like carrying things, cleaning work, and usually building related and construction related work, which is very hard labor, and that's what my father-in-law does. And sometimes my mother-in-law does similar things, like kind of not a regular job, but when someone needs help with something for a day or 2 days or a week, she will go and do that. And that's how they make their income. My father-in-law have also done a lot of driving, but he has not been doing that for maybe 2 years now. Like very sparsely he does that now. But he has one of those big trucks, so he can drive like brakes and things like that, which is mainly what he did before. My husband had his own business before, then he quit that, and he's been doing kind of little jobs here and there. But now he's quit all of that, and we are doing social media, both my husband and I will talk more about that later, towards the end of the video, because I had quite a few questions about it. If you could change something about life in rural China, what would it be? That's something that can be changed or can't be changed, or something that I'm planning to do for the local community, the person asked. And if I could change anything, I would change... So I have two things that are the first things I think of. One is domestic violence. It's very common, domestic violence here. Smacking and slapping kids, for example, which I don't agree with. And then there's also a lot of just domestic violence. A lot of husbands, when they are drunk, are beating their wives. And that's something I would love to change, but I don't know how I could possibly change that. I guess like my husband and I can just set an example of a relationship without violence. But yeah, I don't know how I would change it. Another one is garbage. I think a lot of people here, because a lot of food is self-produced, they don't generate as much waste as we do, for example, in Sweden. But if you go to the forest, for example, there's a lot of trash. People are just like throwing it randomly. And I would love to change that too. We mention it, we have a lot of social media accounts, so we mention it sometimes. But the thing is, you can't be like, it's difficult, because if you're angry, like you tell people, don't do that. A lot of people here were like, you can't come and tell us what to do. Because my husband is also younger, like he can't tell anyone older than him what to do. So it's all about, I think, getting people to think about it themselves and like maybe inspire people. But it's difficult to tell people what to do. So this is a question that's really long, and I wanted to answer it because I think I took it quite personally, and I've been like, all these things I have thought about, like I guess when I read it the first time I was a little bit offended, and I want to address this question. Do you really plan to live here all the time? Well, no, I've been quite clear that I don't want to live here all the time. Because it's a closed off area to foreigners, and I need to apply for special permissions like 4 times a year, and I don't want to do that for the rest of my life, so we don't plan to live here all the time. This sounds too scary. You could have better choices. So I have considered all my choices. I know my choices, and this is the choice I made now, and it's not a random choice. I've made it, it's a conscious choice to be here. With your academic education, you can't find a good job in a big city in China or your country. You don't think staying in the countryside after graduation is bad for you, a waste of your own educational resources? And no, I don't think so. I think that's a very bad way to see it. I think that's a very destructive way to see it. And I want, this is happening all over the world in rural areas. People with education leave the rural areas, and left are people who are uneducated, and people who don't make a lot of money, and people who perhaps don't particularly enjoy being in a rural area. I think if you like a rural area and if you have education, then you have a responsibility to be in a rural area, because rural areas need to survive. Rural areas are important, rural communities are important, and people like the knowledge in rural areas are very important. And if everybody who have any type of, any form of education just decides to move to a city, then the rural areas are just withering away. There's nothing happening. They're not developing, they're not changing, they're not alive. And I think it's really important for people with education to move out and to move back to the rural areas and make sure that their communities and the places they come from can continue and can develop and can change, and just preserve them, because rural areas and rural knowledge and all of this is really important. And I think it would be a real waste of educational resources if someone with a good education just decides to live in a big city where everybody else is also well educated. I guess that made me a little bit offended. And there's also a question I think is really important, because all over the world, rural areas are kind of the communities. People, rural areas are losing their communities. And for example, in China, a lot of old people and young children are left, but not people working age. They leave for the cities. And I think that's such a shame. There are so many opportunities that can be found in the countryside if you have an education. If you don't have an education, it's more difficult to create opportunities for yourself. But if you have an education, you can create opportunities, economic opportunities, almost anywhere you are. So yeah, that's my opinion. I still don't understand what made you determined to stay here. Shouldn't it be better to go to Sweden or a big Chinese city with your husband? Yeah, that's kind of what I just explained. And I think regardless if we are in China or in Sweden, we would always live in a rural area because we don't like the cities. And I love countryside and the rural area, and my husband is the same. So what about your child's education? So this is one part that I understand and that I agree with to some extent. The child is innocent. The level of education in rural China will really affect the life of the child. And personally, I think this is a really difficult question. My husband don't particularly like the education system in his village. He would not want Sansan to go to school here. I don't want Sansan to go to school here because I know the teacher hit the kids. If they didn't, I don't think I would mind really. I would love to see him have Chinese education so that he can learn characters and all of that. However, I think a child living in the countryside, living on a farm, living in a rural area, will learn a lot of things and will have a lot of knowledge that people in the city can never get. So I think there are so many important things, so many important skills that a child can learn in a rural area that's not available in the city. We've been talking a lot about education. The next question is this: do you have a medium-term and long-term plan for your kids' education, your own career objective? Does the village energize you to achieve your goal? So when it comes to the kids' education, we don't have a fixed plan yet. We have a lot of ideas. One idea was to have him go to school in Xining and in the city, and then we would spend the weekends in the countryside. Yeah, I don't particularly like that idea. I prefer to just have one place where I live and not living in the city sometimes and in the countryside sometimes. I prefer to live in a rural area. And then another option, of course, is to go to Sweden, which my husband is really supportive of, and I think I've warmed up to the idea. In the beginning, I was very kind of almost obsessed with the idea that I had to go to school in China because I wanted him to learn Chinese character well. I wanted him to read well and write well. But now we are not sure. And our life plan, for our career, our life plan, we have many different ideas and things usually don't go according to plan. So it's very difficult to have any, to make plans or to stick with them, because life changes and our circumstances change. And yeah, it's very difficult. But when it comes to our career objective, we do have both medium term and long term, because our idea of our careers do not depend so much on the location. So we could be in Sweden, we could be in China doing what we do, which is amazing. So that's good. And does the village energize you to achieve your goals? And it definitely does. I think being in the village has inspired me. I lived in Shanghai, and when I lived in Shanghai, I had a lot of ideas, but I never really knew how to do or start any of them. And when I come to rural China, I feel like my path is clearer, like what I want to do is much clearer. So I think that being in a rural area where there are not so many things going on outside of me, I can focus a little bit on like what I want to do, and that's easier to do in like a tranquil little place like this. Do you ever have issues with wild animals in your part of China? Snakes and bears? And we never have issues with any wild animals except from rats. And it's something I would actually have wanted, or I don't want to have problems with bears, but I would have liked if there were more wild animals in the area. But there are not many, especially bigger ones. Like there are rabbits and like wild, I don't know, are they called wild chickens in English? And yeji, that's the Chinese name, wild chicken. And there are some wild animals, but not like the really big ones. Not in our village and like surrounding our village. But obviously if you go up farther on to the plateau where there are less people, there are a lot of wild animals, but I haven't really seen any. And I like seeing wild animals. So, does climate change affect the life in rural China yet? And are people in rural China worried about it? Yes, it affects life here. It's warmer and it affects a little bit like the crops and like when you can plant things and what you can plant and how it grows. And I think the most visible, like two of the most visible things that I haven't noticed because I came too late, but before I came here, when my husband was younger, there would be like the village is surrounded by mountains. There would be mountains and they would have snow all year round. In the middle of summer, there would still be thick layers of snow on the top of the mountains. But nowadays, like the past maybe 5-10 years, all the snow melts away during summertime. And another one is that the water is a little bit more scarce, perhaps, because there are a lot of like rivers and like areas where there used to be water that are completely dried out. And then there's one river, like a smaller one that leads onto a big one. The smaller river that has water if it's been raining a lot, but otherwise it's also all dried out. So that was not the case when my husband was younger. So there are a lot of changes, but people are generally not that worried in my experience. This is just my experience and just for this village. But a lot of people, I think, are not really aware of climate change and the impact it can have and what they can do. And I think this is related to that people with education tend to leave the village and tend to leave the rural areas. If people who were more well-educated stayed, maybe that would not be the case. People would be more aware and maybe there would be more things done about it. So I think it's all related. Western country farm life focuses a lot on animals. That seems to be less true in China. Even the meats they eat seem to be wildlife rather than beef, pork and chicken. Would you comment on how the Chinese use animals? So now I only comment on this area again, and people don't eat wildlife. Like I don't think there's any wild animal that you're allowed to kill and eat, or that you're allowed to kill. So people don't eat wildlife, no wild animals, and people eat pork. They eat lamb, I don't know what you call the sheep meat, mutton, and they eat cows. Yeah, they eat chickens too. So chickens, cows, lambs, sheep, and pigs. Very common. Why you might have that idea is because people don't raise a lot of pigs. In the West, people often have, if they have cows, they maybe have 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 cows, and raising cows and making a living out of them. The people here, when they raise meat, they raise it for themselves, the family. So if they have pigs, they have 1 or maybe 2. If they have cows, they have 1 or maybe 2. If they have chickens, they maybe have 5 chickens or 10 chickens. And sheep, maybe they have 5 sheep. So it's not to the same scale as in the West, because they don't raise it to sell it generally. Of course, there are people who do that too, but generally people have that in the family, and I think that's very common here. Right now we have chickens. My mother-in-law and father-in-law also raise chickens. They raise theirs for meat. I raise mine for eggs, and they usually have a pig, but now at this time, like at this very moment, they don't. But generally they also raise a pig for meat. Is natural infant hygiene common in China? This person has seen crotchless trousers in toddlers, but what about babies? And people usually have crotchless trousers for their babies too. I think it's quite common that during the night they will have wrap something, nowadays usually a diaper, but it's very common also with babies that they have crotchless trousers, and that they do natural infant hygiene, which in the West I think we often call it baby potting. So I think that's pretty amazing, and we use crotchless trousers, not now because he's bigger, Sansan, but before. Sometimes he still has it, but now usually just has his normal trousers. But I think it's really great to listen to the child from an early age and let the child not have to always poo and pee in their diapers. I know my mother-in-law said when my son was 3 or 4 months, when we just got back from Sweden to China, she said, oh, when his cousin was this old, he didn't have diapers, and he was, I think maybe just 4 months. And in Sweden, there are very, very few 4 months old who don't wear diapers. So I think it's a big difference. And is co-sleeping with babies and children common? And yes, like my Sansan's cousin, who's 8 now, has for the first time his own room and his own bed, but until he is now, he's always been co-sleeping, and he still co-sleeps when he is in a village. So co-sleeping is very common. I have never heard about a child, like a small child or a baby, that sleeps on their own in their own bed. That's just unheard of here. Are women comfortable breastfeeding publicly in rural China? And again, rural China in this area, and no, I've never seen anyone breastfeed publicly. A lot of people still, or maybe not still, but a lot of people use formula from a really early age. I think that's because breastfeeding is perhaps not as encouraged. I don't know why. And when you breastfeed, you do that privately. And then this person also asked about crate-out methods to improve children's sleep, and I think this question I don't really know how to answer. Are there any kind of dialects in Qinghai, and do you understand it? Or is Qinghai homogeneous in people type and language? So Qinghai is very varied. There are a lot of different types of people, a lot of different ethnicities, and the major ones are Han, which is the majority population in China, but also Hui, which is a Muslim minority, Tibetans and Mongols. So that's I think the 4 biggest, but then there are over 40 different other ones in this area, in minority groups. So it's very varied. There are a lot of different languages. The most common is, people speak Mandarin usually, especially younger people, but older people in the village speak Qinghai dialect, and everybody in the village speaks Qinghai dialect, but a lot of younger people can switch to Mandarin if they speak to me, for example. But the older people can't. They only speak Qinghai dialect, and Qinghai dialect is almost like a different language. It sounds completely different to Mandarin, although there are similarities, of course, but it sounds very different. And then other languages like Tibetan is very common. If you walk around, a lot of road signs are in Mandarin and Tibetan, and some are even in Arabic. some Arabic script. I don't know if it's actual Arabic. I'm really not that knowledgeable about the minority groups, which is kind of sad. But yeah, I might have to do a video about that. Is it convenient when it comes to hotel and transportation and safe, that means no burglars or scammers, to stay in rural China as a foreigner? And how would you recommend people to visit rural China? I think it's not very convenient at all. I think it's quite difficult, as it is in most places in the world, to find like a hotel in a rural area, unless it's very close to a tourist attraction. So it's a little difficult. There are some like homestays, but in China, not all homestays and hotels are open to foreigners. So it can be quite tricky to find. But I would recommend going on places like couchsurfing and Helpex and Workaway. That's where before when I traveled in China in rural areas, that's usually where I found my where I found places to stay so that I could experience rural China. But it's not very convenient. I would say it's safe, but of course, I mean, it can be unsafe too. I think you just have to trust your gut instinct. But when it comes to scammers, I think most scammers stick to places where there are a lot of tourists. So that's actually a positive thing. In rural areas, there are usually not that many tourists, so I think there are not very many scammers. And then Kaisa A asked if I ever thought about bringing the composting toilet from Finland to Qinghai. And it had not crossed my mind until you mentioned it, but I might very well do so. Who knows? What's the difference between Chinese villages and Swedish ones? So in Chinese villages, I'm just going to mention a few because there are a lot of differences. I think, like I mentioned before, in China, people are usually self-sufficient in things like wheat and oil, things like that as well. In Sweden, it's very uncommon to grow wheat and rapeseed on a small scale. And another one is that in China, the villages are usually centered, like in the center, all the houses. Like the living houses, and then the fields are outside of the village, like surrounding the village. But in Sweden, people usually have one house and then they have their fields surrounding their house. And then there's another field, and in the middle of those fields there is another house. So it's kind of further away between the houses, and that also leads to less of a community feeling, I think, in Sweden, which is kind of sad. But then I also like the idea of waking up, opening your door, and you have your fields right outside. So it's, good and bad. And now comes a question about me and YouTube and social media. And I've decided to add this to this rural life video because it kind of belongs together. So people ask, how long do you plan to do this, making videos about rural China? Will the themes change in the future? And yes, the themes will probably change a little bit. My vision now, this might change, is to make more kind of documentary style. Like, I feel I'm still learning a lot about filmmaking, but the better I get, I want to make more kind of documentary style videos. My husband just came home, if you're wondering about the noise. I would love to see a little bit more handicrafts and maybe focusing a little bit on other people's stories, like the people I meet, and make videos about them. But it will take a little bit longer to make those kind of videos. And yeah, so I'm hoping, like, that's my vision for the future, and I'll see if I can get there. But I would also like to make more about Sweden, like kind of just have this channel be a mix about Sweden and China, about rural lifestyles and about kind of sustainable lifestyles, about handicrafts and kind of traditional wisdom and traditional knowledge, and then have a mixture of both countries. What's your job in China? So I don't have a job in China. My husband, we do social media. So my job is not in China. I am doing, I have not registered yet, but I'm paying my taxes in Sweden, and I have my YouTube, where I don't make a lot of money, and my Patreon, where I make most of my money. So thank you all my patrons, you're amazing. And my husband works with our Chinese accounts. So he has 3 main main social media that we use in China, which is 西瓜视频 and it's Kuaishou and Bilibili, and those are like our income in China. And it's not a lot, but it's still like better than what he would expect as if he went out to work, because he doesn't have a university degree. So the kind of jobs he would have pays like maybe 3,000 or 4,000 renminbi a month. So this is at least what he would get if he got a job, and often, not always, but often a little bit more, which is nice. And hopefully it will only get better and better, because we started like going full-time doing social media and like not doing anything else this year. So I think this is a good start. We don't, like from the start of this year, we don't do anything else but social media. But we're also, and like my husband, when he's doing our Chinese social media, he is also live streaming and selling products, and we are launching our own product later this year. Not sure if it will be like available internationally, but I hope so. And so we're kind of like basing our lives now, making a living on social media. Yeah. And that was all the questions for this video. And thank you so much for watching. If you have any other questions, leave them below and I'll try to answer. I know I'm terrible at answering comments. So I probably do some Q&As every now and again too, because I want to answer everyone, but then I feel bad and then I don't, and I read comments, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna answer this, but I need some time, so I'm gonna answer it later, and then that comment is lost amongst all the other comments, and it's just tricky. But I really appreciate all of you asking questions and watching my videos, so thank you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.